The courtroom air was thin and stale, smelling of old paper and cheap floor polish. It was a sterile, indifferent space, designed to process human misery with bureaucratic efficiency. Samuel Jericho sat on the hard wooden bench, a ghost haunting the defendant's table. His knuckles, raw and chapped from the cold, rested on his knees. His clothes, a threadbare army surplus jacket over layers of faded flannel, were clean but worn to the point of transparency in places. His gray-streaked hair was too long, and his beard was an untamed map of lonely nights, but his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were clear. They held a stillness that was often mistaken for vacancy. Today was no exception. He was a problem to be solved, a file to be closed. Across the room, Officer Miller shifted his weight, the leather of his duty belt creaking in the quiet. He was a young cop, with a thick neck and a face that seemed permanently set in a sneer of petty authority. He looked at Sam not as a man, but as a piece of refuse he'd had the misfortune of scraping off the pristine sidewalks of his patrol route. The judge, a man named Harrison with a weary, perpetually disappointed face, glanced down at the file, then over his glasses at Sam. "Mr. Jericho," he sighed, the name tasting like an inconvenience. "You're here on a charge of loitering and creating a public nuisance." "Officer Miller." Miller stepped forward, a smug little smile playing on his lips. "Your Honor, on the morning of the 5th, I found the defendant here sleeping in the public square. Directly in front of the Veterans Memorial, of all places." He paused for effect, letting the perceived sacrilege hang in the air. "He was unresponsive at first. When I instructed him to move along, he refused to speak, just stared at me. He had established what I would describe as an illegal encampment." Miller gestured toward Sam with a dismissive flick of his hand. "Look at him. He's a drain on city resources. We get calls about him all the time. People are intimidated. He makes the area feel unsafe." The humiliation was a physical thing, a cold weight settling in Sam's chest. He didn't look at Miller. He kept his eyes fixed on the seal of the state carved into the wall behind the judge. He had seen that seal before, long ago, when he had sworn an oath in a room full of proud young men. The memory was a distant echo, a song from a different life. He felt the familiar shame, not for his current state, but for the fact that he was being seen this way, that the quiet promise he had worked so hard to keep was being twisted into a crime. The prosecutor, a young woman in a sharp suit, stood and added, "The people recommend the maximum fine and a court-ordered stay away from the downtown district, Your Honor. We need to send a message that this kind of vagrancy will not be tolerated." The courtroom was nearly empty. A law student taking notes, a couple waiting for a civil hearing, a bailiff leaning against a wall, studying his fingernails. No one looked at Sam with anything other than mild curiosity or annoyance. He was invisible, a piece of social debris caught in the gears of the justice system. His silence was his only shield, the last piece of ground he would not surrender. To speak would be to beg, and he had sworn he would never beg. He had faced down men with guns, had held dying friends in his arms. He would endure this. He would take the judgment and carry it, just as he carried everything else. The judge nodded, his mind already made up. "Mr. Jericho, do you have anything to say for yourself?" he asked, the question a mere formality. Sam's gaze didn't waver from the seal on the wall. His silence filled the room, heavy and absolute. Miller scoffed audibly. "See? Nothing. Not a word. No respect for the court. No respect for the law." The officer's voice dripped with condescending certainty. He was enjoying this, the simple, clean power of defining another man's worth and finding it wanting. He saw Sam's silence not as dignity, but as defiance born of guilt or mental deficiency. "Your Honor, this is what we're dealing with every day. They don't want help. They just want to take over our public spaces." Miller puffed out his chest, positioning himself as the valiant defender of civic order against the encroaching tide of decay that Sam represented. I approached the defendant respectfully. I said, "Sir, you can't sleep here." He just gave me this blank stare. The 1,000-yard stare, they call it. Probably thinks he's still in some war. The comment was designed to wound, to reduce a complex history to a cheap, dismissive cliché. A few people in the room might have felt a flicker of discomfort, but no one spoke up. The narrative was too easy, too familiar. The ragged, silent man was a broken soldier, a ghost who had failed to reintegrate, a problem with no simple solution. Therefore, he was simply a problem. The judge, Harrison, tapped his pen on his desk, his patience wearing thin. "Officer, your point is made," but Miller wasn't finished. He saw an opportunity to solidify his own image as a sharp, observant cop. "We ran his name, Samuel Jericho. No fixed address. No employment history for the last decade. He's been cited for similar offenses in 3 other towns up north. He's a professional transient, Your Honor. A ghost in the system. He contributes nothing." The word nothing echoed in the sterile room. It was a final judgment, delivered before the judge even had a chance to speak. It was an erasure. Sam felt the word land, not like a blow, but like a shovelful of cold earth. Nothing. Was that what was left? He thought of the weight of his pack in the desert, the blistering sun, the grit of sand in his teeth that never went away. He thought of the faces of the men he had served with, young men who had contributed everything, whose names were now carved into stone. He was alive and they were not. His contribution was to remember. That was the promise. He would carry their names, their stories, their laughter until his own time was done. This small, daily humiliation was part of the price. The prosecutor chimed in, eager to close the case. "Given the defendant's refusal to cooperate or even speak, we believe he presents a continuing issue. The stay-away order is crucial for the community's peace of mind." Sam finally lowered his eyes from the state seal. He looked at his hands, at the dirt permanently etched into the lines of his palms. He could feel the cold concrete of the Memorial Plaza through the thin soles of his boots, a place he had come to see as sacred ground. He hadn't been sleeping. He had been standing watch. But explaining that to these people in this room would be like trying to describe the color of the sky to a man born blind. It would be a violation of the memory itself. His silence was not contempt for the court. It was reverence for what they could not understand. He had made a vow in the dust of a foreign land, a promise to a dying friend, a young corporal named Danny, who had worried that everyone would forget. "Don't let them forget us, Sarge," he'd whispered, his blood warm on Sam's hands. "Don't let us just become a name on a wall," and Sam had promised. So he kept watch. He kept the marble clean. He kept the litter away. He was not a nuisance. He was a sentry. The conflict was not between him and Officer Miller. It was between 2 entirely different worlds, one of sterile rules and tidy appearances, and another of blood, sacrifice, and unbreakable oaths. And in this room, only one of those worlds had a voice. The judge looked at Sam, his expression a mixture of pity and frustration. "Mr. Jericho, I'm going to give you one last chance to speak. A simple apology, an agreement to move on, and we can resolve this with a minimal fine." Sam slowly shook his head. Not in defiance, but in sorrow. He could not apologize for honoring his dead. Miller smirked, turning to the prosecutor with a look that said, "I told you so." The trap was sprung. The narrative was complete. Samuel Jericho, the broken veteran, the public nuisance, was guilty as charged. As Officer Miller's voice droned on, a cascade of accusations designed to paint Sam as a social parasite. Sam's mind retreated to the only place he still had any control. It wasn't a conscious decision, but a reflex, a drawing inward to a core of memory that the cold courtroom could not touch. The smell of diesel fumes and roasting goat from a market in Kandahar. The rough, comforting weight of his M4 rifle, its metal cool against his cheek. The specific shade of the sky at dusk in the high desert, a deep, impossible purple that promised a brief respite from the relentless sun. These were not grand, heroic memories of battle. They were the small, sensory details that made up the fabric of a life he had lived so intensely that everything since felt pale and washed out. He remembered Corporal Danny Miller, no relation to the sneering officer across the room, a cosmic irony that was not lost on Sam. A kid from Ohio who could quote Shakespeare and field strip a machine gun in under a minute. They had shared a bond forged in equal parts boredom and terror. Danny had a picture of his high school sweetheart, a girl named Sarah, that he would show to anyone who would look. "Gonna marry that girl, Sarge?" he'd say. His face lit with a hope so bright it was almost painful to behold. "Gonna build her a house with a big porch." Then came the memory Sam fought against every single day, the one that always broke through the perimeter of his defenses. The deafening roar, the cloud of acrid smoke, the sudden, shocking silence that followed. He remembered crawling through the dust, his ears ringing, calling Danny's name. He found him by the wreckage of a Humvee, his legs gone, his eyes wide with a surprise that was quickly fading into something else. Danny wasn't screaming. He was calm. He looked at Sam and tried to smile. "Hey, Sarge," he'd coughed, a trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. "Guess that porch is gonna have to wait." Sam had held him, trying to stop the bleeding with his hands, with the fabric of his own uniform, a useless, desperate act. And it was then that Danny had made his request. "Don't let them forget us, Sarge. Don't let me just be a name." Sam had looked into the eyes of the dying 20-year-old and made the most sacred promise of his life. "I won't, Danny. I swear to you. I won't." This was the source of his quiet strength, the bedrock of his endurance. The humiliation he felt now was nothing compared to the guilt of survival. His homelessness wasn't a failure. It was a self-imposed penance, a way to stay untethered from a world that felt frivolous and shallow. He couldn't build a house with a porch. He couldn't get married. He couldn't participate in a life that Danny and the others had been denied. So instead, he bore witness. He found their names on memorials in forgotten towns and stood guard. He polished the brass letters, pulled the weeds, and kept their memory alive in the only way he knew how. The charge against him, creating a nuisance, was because Officer Miller had found him at 3 a.m. with a bucket of water and a soft cloth, carefully washing the grime from the engraved names on the black granite wall. He had been there all night, working under the moonlight. When he finished, exhausted, he had sat at the base of the monument, his back against the cold stone, and closed his eyes for just a moment. That was when the flashlight beam had hit his face. He hadn't refused to speak to Miller out of contempt. He had been unable to speak, his throat thick with the grief that always came after the ritual was complete. He was not a vagrant defiling a sacred space. He was a priest tending his altar. But he would never say these words aloud. The promise to Danny was a private covenant. To use it as a defense would be to tarnish it, to turn a sacred duty into a plea for pity. And so he remained silent, his past a locked room, the key long since thrown away. The judge's voice cut through his reverie, sharp and final. "Mr. Jericho, your silence is being interpreted as contempt. This is a simple matter that you are making unnecessarily difficult." The pressure in the room was now immense, a palpable force pressing down on Sam. Judge Harrison's face had hardened. The sliver of professional pity he might have felt had been eroded by Sam's stoic refusal to participate in the choreographed dance of the legal system. He was an anomaly, a glitch in the proceedings, and the judge's only remaining tool was the blunt instrument of sentencing. "Officer Miller's testimony is uncontroverted," the judge declared, his voice resonating with judicial finality. "I find you guilty of the charges." He peered over his glasses at Sam, a deep frown creasing his brow. "Given your lack of cooperation and the need to maintain public order, I am sentencing you to a fine of $500. A quiet gasp came from the law student in the gallery. $500 might as well have been $5 million to a man like Sam. It was a sentence of incarceration by other means. And, the judge continued, his voice like stone, "I am issuing a mandatory stay-away order for the entirety of the downtown commercial district, including the public square, for a period of 1 year. A violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and a sentence of no less than 90 days in jail." The word struck Sam with the force of a physical blow. A year. He would be barred from the memorial, barred from keeping his promise. The fine was an inconvenience. Jail was just a place. But being forbidden from standing his post, from tracing Danny's name with his fingertips, from keeping his silent vigil, that was an attack on the very core of his existence. It was a desecration. For the first time, A flicker of raw emotion crossed Sam's face. A deep, aching despair. His shoulders, which had remained ramrod straight, slumped almost imperceptibly. He had endured everything, believing his silent honor was its own reward. Now, the system was taking even that away from him. The community, what little of it was present, remained silent. The bailiff shifted his weight, ready to escort Sam out. The prosecutor gathered her papers, her work done. Officer Miller allowed himself a triumphant, almost invisible smile. He had won. He had successfully purged the blight from his pristine downtown. The system had worked. It had identified a problem, processed it, and issued a solution. The human cost was not a variable in the equation. Sam felt the air leave his lungs. He was trapped. He could not pay the fine. He would not be able to stay away from the memorial. His promise was stronger than any court order. He would be arrested, jailed, and the cycle would continue until he was completely broken. He was at the edge of a precipice, staring into a void of utter hopelessness. He braced himself for the bailiff's hand on his shoulder, the final, dismissive touch that would lead him from the room and into the next phase of his erasure. The world had forgotten Danny, and now it was determined to forget him, too. The gavel was about to fall, a wooden hammer poised to shatter the last fragments of his purpose. Just as the judge lifted the small mallet, ready to bring the proceedings to a close, Sam moved. It wasn't a large movement, just a slow, deliberate straightening of his spine. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping softly against the linoleum, and stood. He did not look at the judge or at Miller. His pale blue eyes were fixed on the middle distance, on a place only he could see. The bailiff took a half-step forward, tensing, but Sam's posture was not threatening. It was infused with a sudden, profound solemnity. "I accept the court's judgment," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, a low, gravelly sound that seemed to absorb the room's ambient noise. It was the first time he had spoken, and the unexpected sound made everyone freeze. The judge lowered the gavel, his hand hovering in midair. Miller's smirk faltered. Sam reached slowly into the inside pocket of his worn jacket, the one place he kept his few essential treasures. The prosecutor watched his hand, a flicker of alarm in her eyes, but his movements were too slow, too deliberate for aggression. He withdrew a small, rectangular object wrapped in a piece of faded, oil-stained cloth. With painstaking care, he unwrapped it. It was a photograph, its edges soft and frayed with time, the image bleached by a long-ago sun. He held it not for the judge or the jury that wasn't there, but for himself. It was a picture of his unit, a dozen young men in dusty fatigues, grinning at the camera, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. They were impossibly young, vibrant, alive. In the center, a fresh-faced kid with a wide, hopeful smile was unmistakable. Corporal Danny Miller. Sam didn't say who they were. He didn't explain the significance. He simply held the photo in his calloused hands, his thumb gently tracing the edge of the image. It was not a plea. It was not evidence. It was an act of remembrance, a final, quiet defiance against the verdict of nothing. He was showing the room, and himself, that he was not empty. He was a vessel of memory. He held the ghosts of a dozen men inside him, and he would not let them be dishonored by this place. He stood there for a long moment, a silent, solitary monument to a forgotten promise. Then, with the same deliberate care, he rewrapped the photograph and placed it back in his pocket, over his heart. He had accepted their judgment, but he had done so on his own terms, reaffirming his own code in the face of theirs. The small, personal act of dignity completely altered the atmosphere. The judge stared, his legal certainties momentarily shaken by this display of quiet, inexplicable grief. The board reporter suddenly sat bolt upright, his journalistic instincts screaming that he was missing the real story. Sam's action was a stone dropped into the still, murky water of the courtroom, and the ripples were just beginning to spread. It was then that the sound began. It was a low, distant rumble, so faint at first it might have been mistaken for a passing truck or a tremor in the building's old foundation. But it didn't fade. It grew. It was a deep, guttural thrumming that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of their feet. It was the sound of thunder on a clear day, a sound that spoke of power and mass and relentless forward motion. Heads in the courtroom began to turn, looking towards the high, arched windows that faced the street. The judge frowned, annoyed by the interruption. "What is that noise?" he demanded of the bailiff. The bailiff, his face suddenly pale, walked to a window and peered out. His eyes widened. He turned back to the judge, his mouth slightly agape, unable to form words. The rumble was no longer distant. It was a deafening, earth-shaking roar that engulfed the courthouse. The windows rattled in their frames. A fine layer of dust sifted down from the ornate ceiling fixtures. It wasn't one engine. It was dozens. A symphony of controlled chaos. The distinctive, staggered beat of Harley-Davidson V-twin engines. It was the sound of a pack. Officer Miller looked confused, then alarmed. He instinctively put a hand on his service weapon. The prosecutor stared at the vibrating windows, her composure finally cracking. The law student was on his feet, phone in hand, trying to see what was happening. The sound was a physical presence now, a wave of pure auditory force that drowned out all thought, all procedure. It was a primal, intimidating sound that promised something was about to break. It wasn't just noise. It was an announcement. The roar grew to a crescendo and then, all at once, the engines cut out. The sudden, absolute silence that followed was more jarring than the noise itself. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, with the held breath of every person in the room. All eyes were on the double doors at the back of the gallery. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, one of the heavy oak doors swung inward, pushed open with a slow, deliberate force. A man filled the doorway. He was colossal, a mountain of denim and leather. A thick, graying beard covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes, set deep under a weathered brow, missed nothing. On his leather vest, his cut, was a patch that read President, stitched above the notorious, instantly recognizable emblem of the Hells Angels. He didn't enter immediately. He stood on the threshold, his presence sucking the air from the room, and his gaze swept over the scene. He saw the judge, the prosecutor, the cowering Miller, and then his eyes found Sam. The hard lines on his face softened, replaced by a look of profound, unwavering respect. Behind him, more men began to file in. One by one, they entered the courtroom, their heavy boots making no sound on the polished floor. They moved with a disciplined, unnerving silence. They were all huge, all clad in the uniform of their brotherhood. Worn leather cuts adorned with patches that told stories of miles traveled and loyalties sworn. Enforcer SGT at arms road captain, they filled the empty gallery benches, row after row. 10 men became 20. 20 became 50. 50 became 100. They kept coming, a silent, unstoppable river of leather and denim. They didn't speak. They didn't threaten. They didn't have to. Their sheer, overwhelming presence was a statement more powerful than any weapon. They filled every available seat, then stood shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, and then spilled out into the hallway. The small, sterile courtroom was transformed into a den of lions. The air grew thick with the smell of road dust, engine oil, and old leather, a scent of the open road that was a world away from the room's antiseptic odor. Judge Harrison sat frozen behind his bench, his gavel forgotten. His authority had vanished, replaced by the primal authority of the pack. Officer Miller seemed to shrink inside his uniform, his face ashen. He was no longer a symbol of the law. He was just a man, suddenly and terrifyingly outnumbered. The bikers' collective gaze was a tangible force. They were not looking at the judge or the cop. Every single one of them, all 120 men, was looking at Samuel Jericho. Their faces were hard, weathered, and fierce, but in their eyes as they looked at the small, disheveled man at the defendant's table, there was no judgment. There was only a quiet, resolute solidarity. It was an honor guard, assembled in a place of dishonor. The last biker had entered. The president, the man they called Preacher, walked slowly down the central aisle. His boots made soft, heavy footfalls that echoed in the stunned silence. He stopped just behind the defendant's table, a few feet from Sam. He did not look at Sam yet. Instead, he turned his gaze to Judge Harrison. "Your Honor," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the center of the earth. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed. "With the court's permission, I'd like to speak on behalf of this man." It was not a request. It was a command wrapped in the thinnest veneer of courtesy. The judge, his face a mask of disbelief and fear, could only nod. He licked his lips, his throat suddenly dry. "You may approach the bench?" Preacher shook his head. "I'll speak from here." He turned his body slightly, so he was addressing the entire room, but his words were aimed like a rifle at the judge and Officer Miller. "My name is John Preacher Riley. I am the president of this charter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club." He paused, letting the name and title settle. "We are here today for Sergeant Samuel Jericho," he said, the rank, Sergeant, with a reverence that made it sound more important than "Your Honor." Officer Miller has described Sergeant Jericho as a nuisance, a vagrant, a man who contributes nothing. Preacher's eyes, cold as steel, flicked to Miller, who flinched as if he'd been struck. "I'm here to tell you who this man is." The entire courtroom leaned in. The reporter was scribbling frantically in his notepad, his pen flying across the page. Preacher's voice dropped, becoming more personal, more intense. "For the past 5 years, Samuel Jericho has been the unpaid, unseen, and unofficial guardian of the Veterans Memorial in your town square. He's there every week, usually in the dead of night, when no one is watching. He pulls the weeds. He picks up the trash left by your high school kids. He scrubs the bird droppings off the granite. And on the anniversary of the day his unit was ambushed in Afghanistan, he spends the entire night polishing every single name on that wall until it shines." A wave of shock rippled through the room. The prosecutor's professional mask crumbled, revealing a young woman's shame. The judge stared at Sam, truly seeing him for the first time. Sam himself kept his eyes down, his face unreadable, but his hands were clenched into tight fists on the table. "The illegal encampment Officer Miller described," Preacher continued, his voice dripping with contempt, "was a bucket of water, a rag, and a man who had collapsed from exhaustion after honoring his fallen brothers. He wasn't loitering. He was performing a sacred duty. A duty that, apparently, no one else in this town was willing to do." Preacher then revealed the detail that tied it all together. "We know this because we watch. We respect a man who respects the fallen. But we know him for another reason. 6 months ago, on a bitter cold night, a few of our prospects were stranded on the highway just outside this town, their bikes broken down. They were cold, miserable, and had no money on them. This man," he pointed a thick, tattooed finger at Sam, "walked 5 miles from a shelter to bring them hot coffee he'd bought with the last $4 to his name. He didn't know who they were. He didn't ask for anything. He just saw men in need and he acted. That's the kind of man Samuel Jericho is." The story hung in the air, a stunning testament to character. A man with nothing, giving his last everything to strangers. Preacher's gaze returned to the judge. "He doesn't talk about his past. He wouldn't want me to tell you this, but you need to know. Sergeant Samuel Jericho is a recipient of the Silver Star for gallantry in action. He ran through enemy fire to pull 3 men, one of them my own nephew, out of a burning vehicle. He held his corporal, Danny Miller, as he died, and promised him he would never be forgotten. He let the name Danny Miller land with heavy significance. He keeps his promises. That's his contribution. It's more than most will ever give." The truth, now fully revealed, was devastating. It shattered the court's narrative and exposed the gross injustice for all to see. The room was utterly silent, save for the quiet, rhythmic breathing of 120 bikers bearing witness. Samuel Jericho was not a ghost. He was a pillar. The transformation in the courtroom was absolute. The air, once thick with judgment, was now heavy with shame and awe. Judge Harrison sat slumped in his high-back chair, his face pale. The authority had drained from him, leaving only a tired old man who had been party to a terrible mistake. He looked from Preacher's unyielding face to Sam's bowed head, then to Officer Miller, who was now sweating profusely, his smugness replaced by a raw, primal fear. Miller's eyes darted between the judge and the silent wall of bikers blocking the exit. There was no escape. The prosecutor, her face flushed with embarrassment, stood slowly. "Your Honor," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The people moved to dismiss all charges against Mr. Jericho." With prejudice, Judge Harrison nodded quickly, gratefully. "Charges are dismissed. This case is closed." He looked directly at Sam, his voice filled with a contrition that was utterly sincere. "Mr. Jericho, Sergeant Jericho, on behalf of this court, I offer you my deepest, most profound apology. We have done you a grave disservice, but the bikers were not there for the court's apology. They were there for Sam." As the judge's words faded, a path cleared through the silent ranks of leather-clad men. Preacher walked to the defendant's table. Sam finally looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting the biker president's. There was no pity in Preacher's gaze, only a deep, shared understanding, a mutual respect between two men who lived by a code. Preacher didn't offer a handshake or a slap on the back. The moment required something more. He turned and nodded to one of his men, the sergeant-at-arms, who came forward carrying a carefully folded object. It was not a vest or club colors. It was something far more significant. The sergeant-at-arms handed Preacher a pristine, perfectly folded American flag, the kind presented at a soldier's funeral. The crisp, clean colors were a stark contrast to the drabness of the courtroom. In the suffocating silence, Preacher and his sergeant-at-arms expertly unfolded the flag, holding it taut between them. The bright stars and bold stripes filled the space in front of the bench, a sudden, vibrant symbol of the ideals Sam had fought for. Then, with the precise, practiced motions of a military honor guard, they began to fold it. Each of the 13 folds was sharp, deliberate, meaningful. The first fold, a symbol of life. The second, a symbol of belief in eternal life. Each crease was a tribute, a piece of a ritual that honored sacrifice. They folded the flag into a tight, perfect triangle, with only the blue field of stars showing. The entire process was conducted in complete, reverent silence. When they were finished, Preacher took the folded flag. He walked to Sam, who had risen to his feet, his posture now ramrod straight, the posture of a soldier receiving a commendation. Preacher held the flag out in both hands. "This does not belong to them," he said. His voice a low rumble meant only for Sam. "It belongs to men like you." Sam reached out, his trembling hands accepting the weight of the flag. He pulled it to his chest, holding it tight, his knuckles white. It was more than cloth. It was the restoration of his honor. It was a shield against the verdict of nothing. He had been seen. His promise had been recognized. Officer Miller, seeing his chance while all eyes were on Sam, tried to sidle toward a side door. He didn't get 2 steps before 2 of the largest bikers silently moved to block his path. They didn't touch him. They didn't speak to him. They just stood there, 2 immovable mountains of leather and muscle, their cold eyes promising a different kind of justice, one that would not be delivered in a courtroom. The reporter, his story now an epic of redemption and brotherhood, finally lowered his pen, simply watching the profound, silent drama unfold. The dignity that had been stripped from Samuel Jericho was being returned to him, not by the system that had failed him, but by the outlaws who understood his code. The heavy courtroom doors swung open, and Sam walked out into the bright slash of sunlight in the hallway. He moved differently now. The defeated slump was gone, replaced by the straight-backed gait of a man whose worth had been reaffirmed. He clutched the folded flag to his chest like a sacred text. The 120 bikers followed, their heavy boots silent on the marble floor. They didn't crowd him or speak to him. Instead, they formed 2 parallel lines, creating a wide, clear path from the courtroom doors to the courthouse steps. It was a spontaneous honor guard, a corridor of silent, leather-clad sentinels. As Sam stepped out of the courthouse and into the afternoon sun, a sound erupted that shook the very foundations of the city square. It was the synchronized roar of over 100 V-twin engines starting at once. The thunderous salute was not an act of aggression but a declaration of allegiance, a deafening chorus of respect that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The few pedestrians on the street stopped dead in their tracks, staring at the incredible sight. A lone, disheveled man holding a folded flag, being honored by a formidable army of Hell's Angels whose motorcycles lined the entire block. Preacher walked over to Sam, the roar of the engines a backdrop to their quiet moment. He stood beside him, looking not at Sam, but out at the street. "The memorial is clean, Sergeant," he said, using the rank as a title of ultimate respect. "We took care of it this morning." Polished every name. Sam nodded, his throat too tight to speak. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek, but his face was serene. He was no longer alone in his vigil. "We'll be around," Preacher added, a simple statement that was also a binding promise. "If anyone bothers you again, they'll have to talk to us." He gave Sam a short, sharp nod, the highest form of acknowledgement one warrior could give another. Then he turned, swung a leg over his gleaming Harley, and with a final look at Sam, he fired the engine to life, its sound joining the chorus. Sam did not ride away with them. He was not one of them, and they did not ask him to be. They had simply recognized him as one of their own kind, a man of honor, a keeper of promises. He watched as, with a signal from Preacher, the entire column of bikers pulled out onto the street, their formation tight and disciplined. They rode past the memorial, their engines a rolling tribute, before thundering off toward the highway, their sound slowly fading into the distance. Samuel Jericho was left standing alone on the courthouse steps, the world suddenly quiet again. He looked down at the flag in his arms, then across the square to the Veterans Memorial, its black granite gleaming in the sun. He was still homeless. He was still poor. But he was no longer invisible. He walked down the steps, his purpose clear. He crossed the street, not as a vagrant to be shooed away, but as a guardian returning to his post. The reporter watched him go, knowing he had just witnessed the rarest of stories, a man's soul being saved. The few onlookers who remained saw not a homeless man, but a soldier. Sam reached the memorial and stopped. He ran his hand over the cool, smooth stone, his fingers tracing the letters of a familiar name, Dannymiller. He stood his watch, the folded flag held securely in his arms, a silent sentry whose honor, once questioned, was now undisputed, protected by the distant, fading thunder of his brothers.